There are hundreds of chapters of the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes, all with their own unique colour scheme. And in this video we're going to show you how to paint 8 of those chapters, the Marines of the First Founding, up to battle ready standard, using tips and techniques to get your models on the table in no time at all. Now, we've already made a video called Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready, in which we show you how to paint an Ultramarine all the way through. In this video, we're going to concentrate on things that make other chapters different, such as the power armor colours, the trim of the Aquillas, different things on the model that make them different. So grab your paints and your brushes and let's get started. So the first chapter we're going to look at are the Noble Blood Angels. And you can see to prepare our model for painting, we've already undercoated our Assault Intercessor here with Mephiston Red spray. Now the first thing we're going to be doing over the top of that is actually reapplying the base coat of Mephiston Red out of a pot with a brush, which may sound a bit strange, but the reason we're doing this is twofold. First of all, we're going to make sure the entire model is covered with red paint and there's no cheeky bits of plastic showing through. And second of all, later we may want to go back and correct any mistakes we make, and doing this ensures the colours will be perfectly matched. So for this, I've grabbed my extra large base brush, and let's get cracking. Let's take a little bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette. Here, we're going to add just a touch of water to make sure it's thinned down. We want this to be a nice thin coat of paint. Then, onto our Blood Angel. Here, we're going to be applying this Mephiston Red all over the entire miniature. A nice thin coat, just making sure the entire model is covered with Mephiston Red. So there we go, that's the base coat done. Alright, up next let's have a look at shading the recesses of our Space Marines armour. And for this we're actually going to use a contrast paint, Flesh Tearers Red, because the high flow and the high pigmentation of a contrast paint is perfect for shading a Space Marines armour. Grab yourself your small layer brush and take some paint from the pot like so and onto the palette. Now we're not thinning this paint down at all, we're just making sure we're not overloading our brush with too much paint. So we want a nice thin brush, there we go, that's absolutely perfect. Then onto our Blood Angel. Here we're very carefully painting it into the recesses of the Space Marines armour. So just carefully taking it around the model like so. Now take your time on this, there's a lot of recesses on a Space Marine like this, so it's important to take your time and be as neat as you possibly can. But don't worry if you do make a mistake, you can always go back with Mephiston Red paint in a pot and correct it if you do go too fat with those shades. So there we go, that is the recesses painted with Flesh Tearers Red. Up next, let's have a look at the black Aquillas worn by the Space Marines of the Blood Angels chapter, and for this we'll start off with a base coat of Eshin Grey, followed by a wash of Nuln Oil. First of all, that base coat of Eshin Grey. Again, we're using our small layer brush for this. Let's take a little bit of paint from the pot here, and onto our palette. Now again, I'm just going to thin it just a touch, not too much though. There we go, that's absolutely perfect. Then, onto our Blood Angel. Here we're very carefully going to paint it onto his Aquila, that's the eagle on his chest at the front there. Very careful here, try as hard as you can again to be as neat as possible. Again, don't worry if you make a mistake, just go back with a Mephiston Red paint in the pot and sort it out. And up next, a coat of Nuln Oil shade over the top of the Aquila, again using a small layer brush. Once this is dried, we're then going to go back and paint the rest of the Marine using techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video. There we go, that's our Blood Angel Battle Ready. Alright, let's have a look next at the enigmatic Marines of the Dark Angels. And for this we've started with an undercoat of Chaos Black spray. Over the top of this we're going to apply a base coat of that famous green armour, Caliban Green. And we're going to be using our extra large base brush again. Let's grab a bit of paint from the pot here and onto our palette. Now here we're going to add a bit of water just to thin it down to make sure this base coat goes on nice and smoothly. There we go, like that. Then onto our miniature. Here we're very carefully applying this base coat across the entire model like so. Just applying it nice and thinly like this. You might find you need a second coat of this once it goes on. And don't worry too much about being messy at this point. We'll go back later on and paint the rest of the Marine later. Just a nice smooth base coat of Caliban Green all over the Marine. There we go, that's a nice smooth base coat on our Dark Angel. And up next, it's time to add a shade into the recesses of the armour. For this, we'll be using a contrast paint, Black Templar, as it's perfect for the job. Grab yourself your small layer brush and take a little bit of paint from the pot like so and onto the palette. Now, we're not going to be thinning this down at all, just making sure we're not overloading our brush with too much paint. We want a nice smooth tip and a nice thin tip on the brush. So let's just load that brush, perfect. Then onto our Dark Angel. Here, we're very carefully painting it into the recesses around all of the armour. So basically anywhere where two armour panels meet, like this. Be as careful as you possibly can here, trying as hard as you can just to paint it into the recesses. But don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back with a pot of Caliban Green paint and tidy those mistakes up. And there we go, that's our Dark Angel shaded. All right, next up, let's paint the Aquila. That's the eagle on his chest. And for this, we're going to start with the Wraithbone base coat, and over the top of that, a contrast paint skeleton horde will be applied. First of all, time for that Wraithbone base coat. For this, we're using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot and onto our palette here. Just add a touch of water, not too much here, as we're going over quite a dark base coat. Maybe a bit more paint. There we go. Then onto our miniature. Here, we're applying it very carefully onto the Aquila. That's the chest plate on our Dark Angel here. Be as careful as you can here not to go over the edges and hit the green, but if you do, don't worry, just grab that pot of Caliban green and you can correct your mistakes. Over the top of this, a layer of Skeleton Horde contrast paint, again applied with a small layer brush. There we go, the Aquila is done. Alright, up next, I'm going to add the next thing that's distinctive to the Dark Angels, and that's those red weapon casings. For this, we'll start with a base coat of Mephiston red, and over the top of that, we'll add shades in with a contrast paint, Flesh Terrors red. For both of these, we're using our small layer brush. So with the Mephiston red, let's take a bit of paint from the pot here, add it to our palette. Again, we're going to add just a touch of water to thin it down, but not too much. There we go. Then, onto our miniature. Here, we're going to be adding this onto the weapons casings. So that's the casings of both the chainsword and the bolt pistol as well. We're looking for a nice smooth base coat again, so you may need a couple of layers, but take your time, add a nice even thin couple of layers to get a nice solid coat. Over the top of this, we're adding some Flesh Terrors red contrast paint in the recesses only. Again, here we're using a small layer brush, very carefully just picking out the recessed areas. Once this is done, we're going to go back and finish the Marine using techniques seen in the Indomitus Battle Ready Ultramarines video. There we go, that's our Dark Angel Space Marine Battle Ready. Alright, up next let's have a look at the Adeptus Astartes of the Imperial Fists. And for this we've started with an undercoat of grey cere. And over the top of this we're going to be placing a contrast paint, Iyanden Yellow, which is the quickest and easiest way to get a really nice smooth coat of yellow on a Space Marine. So grab your medium shade brush and let's get to it. First of all, let's take a bit of Iyanden Yellow from the pot here and onto our palette like so. Now we're not thinning this down at all, just making sure we're not overloading the brush with too much paint. But we're doing quite a bit of paint on the brush. There we go, that's about right. Then, onto our Space Marine. Here we go, we're going to be placing Iyanden Yellow contrast paint all over the miniature, like so. Don't worry too much about going over the details that aren't power armour. We can always go back and correct those later on. We're looking for a nice, thick coat of Iyanden Yellow all over the model. Now, as you're placing this on the model, make sure you're going around and poking the paint in areas such as this, where it's gathering together. See here? We don't want this to gather together and pull, so it's going to poke that like that, and therefore it's going to get a nice smooth coat. Do this all over the miniature, allow about 20 minutes for it to fully dry, and once that's done we'll move on to the next stage. So there we go, that's our Iyanden Yellow dry. Alright, up next we're actually going to add a bit of an optional step here. We're going to be shading into the recesses of the power armour. Now the contrast paint we've already applied gives a really good recess shade into the power armour, but if you'd like to add extra depth onto that shade, here's how you can do it. We're going to be using another contrast paint here, Gore-Grunter Fur, which we're going to thin down a touch with contrast medium and then apply it very carefully into the recesses of our power armour. So grab your small layer brush and let's get to it. Let's take a bit of contrast medium here and add it onto our palette like so. About 2 brushes will be enough. Then we're going to clean our brush off to make sure there's no medium left on the brush. And then 1 drop of Gore-Grunter Fur, and we're going to mix that together like so. Now we're using a small layer brush here, as you want it to be nice and thin to make sure we're getting into just those recesses of the power armour. Perfect. Then onto our Marine. Here we're very carefully going to paint it just into the recesses of our power armour like so. So just very carefully bringing it around like that, just in the deepest areas of our Space Marine. Like so, you can see. Now this will take a little bit of time to do, but it's really worth taking the time to get that extra shade into your Marine. There we go, that's the shade complete. Next up, let's have a look at painting the red of our Imperial Fist. Here we're going to be covering the Aquila, that's the chest eagle, and also the rims of the shoulder pads as well. We'll start off with a base coat of corn red, and over the top of that, on the Aquila only, we'll add a shade of Nuln Oil. So first of all, that base coat of corn red, and for this we're using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette like this. Here we're going to thin it down just a touch to make sure we're not putting too much of a thick paint on the miniature. There we go. Then onto our model. Here we're very carefully going to be painting the Aquila, that's the chest eagle, on the front of the model, and also the rims of the shoulder pads with corn red. Now here it's important to be as neat as you possibly can, because if you hit any areas of yellow you'll need to go back with grey cere paint in a pot and then reapply the Iyanden Yellow contrast paint over the top. Next up, we're applying a wash of Nuln oil very carefully just onto the aquila on the front of the marine here. So be very careful here not to hit any of the yellow parts of the model, just make sure you're going over the red. Now once this has been applied and it's dry, we're going to go back and paint the rest of the model using tips seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video. And there we go, our Imperial Fist is ready for the battlefield. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting Iron Hand Space Marines, which of course famously are a black armoured Space Marine chapter. Now there's multiple ways of painting black armour on a Space Marine, and in this guide for Iron Hand and the next guide for Raven Guard we're going to show you a couple of ways of doing it. Now for the Iron Hand, we've started off with an undercoat of Chaos Black spray, and the first thing we're going to be doing is applying a base coat all over the miniature with Eshin Grey. And once that's dry, we'll apply a couple of layers of Nuln oil wash over the top to really darken down that armour to give that really cool grimy Iron Hands look. First of all, that base coat of Eshin Grey. And for this we're starting with our extra large base brush. So let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette here. I'm going to add a little bit of water here to just thin it down to make it a nice subtle look on the miniature. There we go, bit more water. Bingo. Then onto our miniature. Here we're going to be applying it liberally all over the entire model like so. Just everywhere where that power armor is going to be, we're just applying this Eshin Grey all over the model. You don't have to be too neat here at all. Don't worry about hitting other details, as we're going to go back and paint those later on. Once that base coat is dry, we're going to apply a liberal layer of Nuln oil all over the miniature using a medium shade brush. Here we're just making sure it's going all over the model and making sure it's not gathering together or pooling. So you can see here in the shoulder pad recess, it's pooling together. Just going to make sure we're just poking that with a brush to make sure it doesn't pull together too much. Now once this first coat has dried, we're going to go back and apply a second coat of Nuln oil. And again, the same rules apply. Just make sure it doesn't pull together in the recesses and gets a nice smooth coat of Nuln oil all over the model. And there we go, that's the power armor done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the white weapon casings we see on Iron Hands. And for this we'll start with a base coat of Corax White. Once that's dry, we'll apply a contrast paint, Apothecary White, over the top of it. And for both of these paints we're going to be using our small layer brush. Let's take a bit of Corax White from the pot here and add it to our palette. Now this is quite a thick base coat paint, so we're going to be adding a little bit of water here just to thin it down to make sure it goes on our model nice and smoothly. A bit more water maybe. There we go, perfect. Then onto our miniature. Here we're painting this white paint onto the weapon casing, so it's going to be going onto the chainsword blade and onto the casing of the bolt pistol as well. You might find as it goes on over a black undercoat that this needs a couple of coats to get a nice solid colour, but not a problem at all. Wait for the first one to dry, then apply a second coat over the first. Over the top of this we're applying a layer of Apothecary White contrast paint, again with a small layer brush here to get a nice thin smooth layer. As it's a contrast paint, make sure you're allowing the paint to move around with the brush, make sure it doesn't gather together in areas and pool. Now once this is dry, we're going to go back and finish the rest of the miniature using techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video. And there we go, that's our Iron Hand done and ready for the battlefield. Alright, up next it's time for that other first founding chapter that wears black armour, it's the Raven Guard. And here we're going to paint black armour slightly different. We'll start off with a base coat of Corvus Black all over the power armour, and then we'll use a contrast paint, Black Templar, to go into the recesses of the armour to help define it. First of all, time for that base coat of Corvus Black, and for this we're using our extra large base brush. So let's grab a bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette. Now as it's a base paint, it's quite thick, so we add a bit of water here just to make sure it's going onto the model nice and smoothly and easily. There we go, bingo. Then, onto our Space Marine miniature. Here we're going to be applying it nice and liberally all over the entire model. Basically, don't worry about hitting any other details that aren't armour, we'll go over those later on. But for now, we're painting the entire Space Marine with Corvus Black. Once that's dry, we'll take a small layer brush and some Black Templar contrast paint and very carefully work it into the recesses all over your Raven Guard Space Marine. So just taking our time here, just working it into the deeper parts where the armour plates meet together, like so. And this will take some time over the entire model, but it's really worth being as neat as you possibly can. And don't worry if you make a mistake and go a bit too thick here, you can always go back with a Corvus Black paint and tidy that up. There we go, that's our Raven Guard's armour shaded. Alright, there's one more thing that makes a Raven Guard Marine unique, and that's the flash of colour on the trim of his right shoulder pad. Now this denotes which company the Marine is from, and for ours it's going to be 3rd Company, so we're going to paint it red. We're going to use Mephiston red and a small layer brush for this. So let's grab a bit of paint from the pot here and onto our palette like this. Now I'm just going to make sure you thin our paint down a little bit like so, to make sure it goes on nice and smoothly, and also we want a nice smooth thin point on the brush as it's a small detail on the Marine. Then onto the model. Here we go, we're going to paint it very carefully now onto the shoulder pad trim. So just brace your fingers and arms against the paint holder like this, and just bring it up against the Marine like so. Very carefully, holding on, and just making sure you don't go over the edges there. If you do make a mistake, don't worry, you can always go back later on and correct it with Corvus Black out of a pot, but try as hard as you can to be as neat as you possibly can here. Now, once this is dried, we're going to go back and paint the rest of the Marine using techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video. And there we go with that, our Raven Guard Space Marine is ready to sneak into battle. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the Space Marines of the Salamanders chapter. Now you can see here we've already prepared our model for painting by undercoating it with Death Guard green spray. And the first thing we're going to be doing is applying that famous green armour colour onto the miniature using Warpstone Glow and an extra large base brush. So let's get straight to it. First of all, let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so and onto our palette like this. Now we're going to be using water here to thin our paint down just a little bit, as you want this base coat to go on nice and smoothly. Just a touch of water, not too much, as Warpstone Glow is quite a thin paint. There we go, that's perfect. Then, onto our Space Marine. Now we're going to apply a nice liberal coat of Warpstone Glow all over the entire Space Marine like this. You'll find as we've used Death Guard green as an undercoat, this should go on quite nicely and evenly. But you may find you need a couple of coats to get a nice solid coat of Warpstone Glow. So don't worry, let the first coat dry, then apply a second coat straight over the top. There we go, we've applied a couple of coats of Warpstone Glow, we've got a nice solid base coat now to work over. So up next, let's shade down into the recesses on the armour, and for this we're going to use a contrast paint because it's perfect for it. We use Dark Angels Green, which we're going to thin down with a touch of contrast medium. So grab your small layer brush and let's do it. Now first of all, let's take a bit of contrast medium and put it onto our palette like so. Just a couple of brushes, like that. Then we'll clean our brush off to make sure there's no medium left on the brush whatsoever. Bit of tissue paper. Then a brush full of Dark Angels Green contrast paint is going to get mixed in there to produce a slightly thinner version of the contrast paint. Then we'll make sure we've got a nice small point on our brush here, as the detail we're going to be painting is very small. So there we go, perfect. Then onto our Space Marine. And here we're very carefully painting it just into the recesses around our Space Marine's armour. So you can see like this, painting where two armour plates meet, we're just painting into the recesses like so. Now this will take some time, but make sure you're being as neat as you possibly can when painting into the recesses like this. Don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back with Warpstone Glow and correct your mistakes. There we go, that's our green armour shaded. Alright, let's have a look at the black armour sections next on our Salamander. That's the backpack and the shoulder pads too. We'll start off with a base coat of Corvus Black, and over the top of that we'll apply Black Templar contrast paint. First of all, that base coat of Corvus Black, and for this we're using our medium layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Now, as this is a base paint, we're going to add a little bit of water here just to thin it down a touch to make sure it goes on real smooth. There we go. Then, onto our miniature. Here we're applying the Corvus Black onto the backpack and onto the shoulder pads too. So that's the entire backpack and onto the sensors of the shoulder pads either side of the Salamander. Over the top of this, we're applying a layer of Black Templar contrast paint. Painting Corvus Black and then Black Templar over top like this will get a nice smooth obsidian look to your armour, and also we'll see natural highlights and shadows going into the recesses as well. Once this is dried, we'll paint the rest of the miniature using the tips and methods in the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video. And there we go, that's our Salamander done. Alright, up next let's have a look at the ferocious Space Wolves of Fenris. Now here we've already prepared our model by undercoating it with Mechanicus Standard Grey spray. Once that's dry, it's time to add that famous blue-grey Space Wolf armour by painting it rust grey all over. Once that's done, we'll then apply shades into the recesses using Agrax Earthshade. First of all, that base coat of rust grey, and for this we're using our extra large base brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and add it to our palette. Now here, we're making sure it's thinned down by adding a bit of water, just so it goes onto the armour nice and smoothly. Perfect. Then, onto our Space Wolf miniature. Here we're applying this nice and liberally all over the miniature. Now you may find, as this is a layer paint being used as a base coat, this is quite a thin coat of paint. Not to worry, just means you had to have a couple of coats on. So let the first one dry, and then we'll go back and we'll paint the second coat. Now that that's dry, let's grab some Agrax Earthshade and a small layer brush, and here we're going to go around the model and drop it very carefully into the recesses on the power armour. So here we go, just dropping it nice and easily down into the recess like so. Just take your time over this and be as neat as you possibly can. But don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back with the rust grey and correct those mistakes if you need to. And there we go, that's our Space Wolves armour shaded in. Alright, up next let's paint those colourful shoulder pads worn by the Space Wolves. We'll start off with a base coat of grey sear on both shoulder pads. Then we'll paint the left shoulder pad with Iandin yellow contrast paint and the right shoulder pad with Blood Angels red contrast paint. For all of these, we're going to be using our medium layer brush. Let's take a bit of paint from the pot like so, and add it to our palette like this. Just a bit of water here just to thin it down to make sure it goes on nice and smoothly. A bit more paint, there we go. Then, onto our miniature. Here we're going to paint the shoulder pads very carefully. Just grey sear, making sure we're getting a nice smooth coverage all over the shoulder pads. Make sure we don't paint the trim at all, make sure you're leaving that the rust grey colour, but don't worry, if you do make a mistake, you can always go back and correct that. Over the left shoulder pad, we're applying Iandin yellow contrast paint. Here we're using a medium brush just to get a nice good coverage, and make sure as the paint goes on, you're applying it in a nice smooth way. Make sure it doesn't gather together anywhere to pull. So we're going to move that paint around to make sure it dries nice and smoothly. Then we're painting his right shoulder pad with Blood Angels red contrast paint. Again, a nice smooth coat over the top here. Now once this is on and it's dried, we're going to go back and paint the rest of the miniature using techniques seen in the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video. And there we go, with those final parts painted in, that's our Space Wolf Battle Ready. And last but not least, of course, it's the Space Marines of the White Scars chapter. And naturally, to prepare our model for painting, we've undercoated it here with Corax White Spray. Once that's dry, we're going to give a really cool effect on the armour by applying a contrast paint over the top, Apothecary White, which we're actually going to use contrast medium to thin down to make sure the colour is nice and subtle. And here's how. Grab yourself your medium shade brush and just get a couple of brushfuls of contrast medium onto your palette like so. Perfect. Then we're going to wash our brush off to make sure there's no medium left on there at all. Then one brushful of Apothecary White comes out and gets mixed onto our palette like so, creating a slightly thinned down version of Apothecary White. Then load your brush up like so, and it's onto the miniature. Here on the Space Marine, we're going to be liberally applying this all over the model like so. It's going to give a really cool effect on this White Scars armour. Just make sure you're not allowing the paint to pull together or gather. You can see down here it's gathering together here. Just going to poke that with our brush to make sure it's not going to pull there. Allow about a good 20 minutes for it to fully dry, and once it has, we'll move on to the next stage. There we go, the Apothecary White has dried on the Space Marine, and just look at that really cool effect it's had on the power armour. Alright, up next we're going to be looking at painting the red Aquila of our Space Marine. Here we're going to start off with a base coat of Mephiston red, and over the top of that a wash will be applied of Nuln oil. For both of these we're using our small layer brush to make sure we've got lots of control. So first of all, let's get some Mephiston red out of the pot like so, and onto our palette here. Add a touch of water, just a little bit, to thin it down to make it go on a little bit easier. There we go. Then onto our Marine. Here we're painting it very carefully onto the Aquila on the front here. Just be real careful not to go over the edges at all. If your Space Marine is a veteran, you can also paint this onto the shoulder pad trim as well. And over the top of this, we're going to add a shade of Nuln oil, which we're going to wash all over the Aquila very carefully, making sure we don't hit any of the white areas of the miniature. And once this is dry, we're going to go back and paint the rest of the miniature using the techniques seen in the Indomitus Battle Ready Ultramarines video. And there we go, with that our White Scar is done. And that concludes our video on painting the 8 alternative first founding chapters of Space Marines up to Battle Ready Standard. Something to remember here when you're applying your paints and your washes, make sure you're being as neat as you possibly can and take your time. But don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always go back later on and correct your mistakes. Remember, if you want to finish off your miniatures on top of what we've seen in this video, make sure you go and check out the Indomitus Ultramarines Battle Ready video as well. And if you'd like to paint the bases on your models, go and check out the Indomitus basing video too. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Happy painting!